please welcome Pradeep Khosla, Chancellor, University of California, San Diego.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Good afternoon, and welcome to this great meeting, and welcome to San Diego. As you can tell, I'm Pradeep Khosla. I know I don't look like that picture, but I used to at one point. Okay. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our luncheon speaker, who's going to explore the topic of student debt. This matter, as you all know, is of deep interest to all of us as we work to improve access and student success. It's an issue of deep concern to countless individuals, families, and policymakers across the country. Sandy Baum is a non-resident senior fellow at the Urban Institute and professor emerita of economics at Skidmore College. Dr. Baum has written and spoken extensively on issues relating to college access, college pricing, student aid policy, student debt, affordability, and other aspects of higher education finance. She has co-authored the College Board's annual publications, Trends in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing, since 2002. Through the College Board and the Brookings Institution, she has chaired major study groups that release proposals for reforming federal and student financial aid. She is the author of Student Debt, Rhetoric and Realities of Higher Education Financing, and a co-author of Making College Work, Pathways to Success for Disadvantaged Students. She is everything we all want to be, and she knows everything we all want to know. So here, please welcome me in joining Dr. Sandy Baum.
Well, that's quite a challenge, although not as big a challenge as the fact that I can't see these screens over. I hope that that one works. Okay, well, I'm excited to talk with all of you today. We're going to talk about student debt. This is an issue that is very much in the news and very much on people's minds these days. And my hope is to add a little bit of objectivity and sanity to the conversation, because it's very much sort of a panic. And in my view, there are a lot of things we should be worrying about student debt, but we should not panic, and we should not be irrationally looking for solutions that aren't going to be very effective. Okay. And I need some help here. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, so the first thing I want to do is dispel some of the notion that this situation is getting worse and worse every day, or that it is just a new thing, that in the recent past, there was no student debt problem. One of the things that's gone on in the conversation is that we used to focus on how much individual students borrow, which is really what we should be concerned about. But ever since the amount of outstanding student debt got past $1 trillion, suddenly that became the number that people are worried about. And so now there's about $1.5 trillion in outstanding student debt. And I think people talk about that because it's a big number and it sounds shocking, but it's very hard to know what to compare it to. Certainly a lot smaller than the outstanding mortgage debt. But this is a graph based on data from the Federal Reserve that shows you how much outstanding student debt has grown over the years. And so those yellow bars, which I guess you can sort of see, are the total amount of outstanding debt, but that red line is the annual increase. And so what you can see is that the growth rate has actually slowed. So it's not that the amount of debt out there is just skyrocketing. It is increasing, and it increases because every time a student borrows a dollar is added to the amount of outstanding debt. The outstanding debt would only shrink if people paid back more loans than they took out. And the population is growing, and the college-age population is growing, and more people are going to college. And it's also true that people who go to college are borrowing more than they used to. Combination of all of those factors, and people are repaying their loans more slowly. So it's growing, but it's not an exploding series. If you look at loans that individual students are taking, you see something of a similar story. These are graphs from the College Board's Trends in Student Aid publication, which, as just mentioned, I've been co-authoring for now 18 years. And the latest version just came out this last week. And this graph shows you grant aid per undergraduate student and federal loans per undergraduate student on the left and per graduate student on the right. So if you look at the graph on the left, that dark blue line is grant aid per undergraduate student. And you see it going up, 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 which is a good story. But the yellow line is federal loans per undergraduate student. And what you see there is that there was a significant rise in the average amount that students borrowed up to 2010-11. And then every year since then, the average loan amount has gone down. So 8 years in a row, the average amount that undergraduate students borrow has fallen. If you asked people about that, like no one would believe that it's true. People, are you sure that's true? How could it be? We're sure that students are borrowing more and more every year. They're not. If you look at graduate students on the right there, the yellow line at the top there tells a somewhat different story. First of all, graduate students on average borrow about 3 times more, about $18,000 instead of $6,000, 3 times more than undergraduate students. And although there was also a peak in 2010-11, and then borrowing per graduate student fell for a few years, it's back up. So about 42% of the federal loans in the most recent year went to graduate students. And if you want to talk about student loans, you have to talk about that part of the issue. I think people in the student loan conversation think only about undergraduate students, but again, 42% of the annual borrowing is for graduate students, and that is the place that borrowing is actually increasing. If you look at the total amount that students borrow every year, graduate students, undergraduate students, everybody, and not just federal loans, but loans also including private loans, loans from all sources. This is a graph of that, and you see the same pattern. The highest amount of borrowing was in 2010-11, and every year since then, the amount that students borrow has gone down. Now, this is aggregate, it's not per student, and part of this has to do with declining enrollments as the economy has recovered and people decide that maybe they can get a job instead of going back to school. But part of it is also the story that we just saw about declining loans per student. So this doesn't mean that students aren't borrowing a lot of money. None of these mean that. This doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of students borrowing too much money. There are students borrowing too much money. But what it does mean is that we're not like on a train wreck that people think about. It's not every year people are borrowing more and more. They're not. When the economy was really weak, you had a lot of people who really couldn't afford to pay for college, going to college, and they were borrowing more and more money, and the states were not funding public institutions, as you all well know, and so student debt was rising rapidly. But it's one of the things that has actually been a more encouraging story as the economy recovers. Another issue is that when people think about who's borrowing and who has debt, they think about the small number of people about whom they've read in the newspaper. And you can imagine that journalists are always looking for the most dramatic stories. So it's like every undergraduate student who borrowed $100,000 for their undergraduate degree has been on the front page of the paper. They're hard to find, but when you find them, you say, oh, there's a dramatic story. And so people tend to think that most students borrow a lot and that most students who finish their undergraduate degrees are actually working at Starbucks, and how are they ever going to pay off their loans? But in fact, you need to look at who holds student debt and how it's held, especially in the conversations about whether we should just erase it all, forgive it all. So a third of borrowers with debt owe less than $10,000. So lots and lots of people are out there with small amounts of debt. But even though it's a lot of people, they only hold about 5% of the outstanding debt because each of them owes so little. These are people largely who went to college for a small amount of time. A lot of people go to college for 6 months or a year, and they borrow $5,000 or $6,000, and then they drop out. And those people actually struggle a lot, many of them, to repay their loans because they don't have a college credential, they don't have the earnings payoff, and therefore, I mean, if you're working at the minimum wage, you can't really make any payments on your loan. So even if it's only $5,000, you're in bad shape, and then you're likely to see it grow and grow because you're not even paying the interest on it. At the other end of the spectrum, at the bottom of this graph, we have the people who owe a lot. So the blue lines are the percentage of borrowers, and the orange lines show the distribution of the debt. And what you see at the bottom is that a very small share of borrowers have high debt levels. So 2% owe $200,000 or more, another 5% owe between $100,000 and $200,000. But among them, that 7% of borrowers who owe $100,000 or more hold a third of the outstanding debt, right? Because, you know, if you owe $100,000, $150,000, that makes a big contribution to the outstanding debt. This is really important when you think about sort of just the description of student debt. Most of those people who owe $100,000, $200,000 went to graduate school. They may be doctors or lawyers. Graduate students can borrow an infinite amount of money, pretty much. And if you were to, so for example, forgive $50,000 of debt for everybody, then there are only a few people who would benefit from it. But it could be a very expensive thing to do, but you don't need to do that much to get at most of the borrowers, and most of the borrowers who are struggling, who are those people at the top of this graph who actually owe small amounts of money. It's also true that about a third of the outstanding debt is held by the top quarter of households in the income distribution. So relatively affluent families disproportionately hold student debt. Why? Because they went to college for a long time, or they went to graduate school, they borrowed a lot of money, they got a lot of education, they are now near the top of the income distribution. The people in the lower quarter of the income distribution don't have much student debt. Many of them never went to college at all, and if they did go to college, they probably weren't there for very long. So it's those people who weren't there for very long who are actually the most vulnerable and for whom student debt really is a crisis. If you look at default rates, and default rates are not a perfect measure of whether students are struggling to repay their loans, but they are nonetheless an indicator. This is official 2-year student loan default rates. We now measure 3-year rates, but what this shows you is over time from 1995-96 to 2011-12, those are the years that people went into repayment. Of the people who went into repayment in those years, the orange bars are the default rates for people who graduated, who earned either a certificate, an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, or a higher degree. The blue bars are the people who did not earn a credential. So in the latest year of people going into repayment, 9% of those who had completed their programs defaulted after 2 years. 24% of those who had not completed their programs defaulted after 2 years. Default rates are 2 to 3 times higher for people who don't complete. And again, it's not that they owe a lot, it's that they have relatively low earnings. And so either they can't afford to pay, or they think, you know what, I didn't get anything from that education. There's no reason why I should pay. I'm going to do something else with my money instead. So it's really important to see that a big part of the student loan problem is a completion problem, because people who complete are much more likely to repay their loans, and a big reason for that is that they see the financial benefits of getting a college degree. Another thing to understand about student loan repayment is that the federal government has set up a system whereby monthly payments are a function of your income, income-driven repayment. It's a complicated system. There are too many plans. People don't know about it. There are bureaucratic barriers. We need to fix the system. But the reality is that that system says you do not have to make unaffordable payments. About a third of borrowers holding debt and about half of the outstanding debt are now in these income-driven repayment plans. And when you're in that plan, the amount that you have to pay every month doesn't depend on how much you borrowed. It only depends on your income. It's a share of your income. So you should never have to default. I mean, why we still have such high default rates, that's something of a mystery and obviously a problem. But these plans prevent people from defaulting because they can't afford their payments. They may default for some other reason, but these income-based repayment plans are a really important solution. Also, these plans forgive remaining debt after a period of time. It might be 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, but if you cannot afford your payments, we will forgive your debt. So proposals to forgive all debt say it's not enough to forgive the debt of people who cannot afford their payments. Let's also forgive the debt of people who can afford their payments. So that's really important because these programs are terrifically important for protecting people for whom the investment in higher education did not work out well. Higher education is a great investment, but it does not work out well for everyone. It doesn't work out well for most people who don't complete, and it doesn't work out well for everyone who does complete. So we do need to protect people from those outcomes. A lot of the conversation is, as I said, about undergraduates, and much of it is about people with bachelor's degrees. It's much more appealing to put a person with a bachelor's degree on the front of the newspaper or the magazine story than to put a photo of a single mother of 3 children who has just gone and tried to earn an associate degree. So we don't see enough of those people. Older students actually borrow more than younger students. They are a population that struggles to repay their loans. But if you're just looking at bachelor's degree recipients, again, borrowing is leveling off. I looked before, the numbers before were about annual borrowing, and annual borrowing is not immediately reflected, of course, in the total amount of debt with which students graduate. But even the total amount of debt with which students graduate is leveling off. This is the average cumulative debt levels of bachelor's degree recipients at public 4-year institutions. And it's in 2017 dollars. I see a typo there in the title, but it's 2017 dollars. And if you look, it starts from 2002 and shows you for every 5 years. And the 2012 and 2017 numbers are pretty much the same. The orange bars are debt per borrower. The blue bars are debt per graduate. That's something else people don't talk about. Only fewer than 60% of the graduates, the bachelor's degree graduates of public 4-year colleges, graduate with debt. A lot of people don't borrow at all. So when you talk about the average debt level, and you say it's close to $30,000, you're talking about the average debt for the 40% who borrowed, not for all students. That blue bar is much smaller because it includes the zeros. So again, things are not going off the rails. However, there are certain groups of students for whom borrowing really is a crisis, people who really are struggling with their debt. And even if they're an income-based repayment, they just may have amounts of debt that are so overwhelming they can't grapple with them, and they may affect their access to credit. So it's really important to look at which students are most vulnerable. And one of the important issues that is fortunately getting a lot more attention these days is differences by race and ethnicity. This is a graph of the cumulative debt of bachelor's degree recipients, 2015-16, by race and ethnicity. So if you look at the bottom bar, the orange 30% is the share of white bachelor's degree recipients who had no debt. And you can see that at the top, it's Asian bachelor's degree recipients. Many more of them graduated without debt, but then the second bar, only 14% of black bachelor's degree recipients managed to graduate without debt. And if you go to the right-hand side, the light blue bars at the end are $50,000 or more. 21% of black college graduates had borrowed $50,000 or more. And that's compared to 10% of white college graduates. Black students are borrowing much more than white students. It's not hard to think about the fact that on average they come from families with lower income, and they come from families with much lower wealth than white families. And then you also have to worry about the fact that after they graduate, because of the structure of the labor market and the persistent discrimination, they tend to have lower earnings than other people with bachelor's degrees. So there's a group of people we should be worried about, and we should be thinking about how we can solve these problems. Another issue is that black students disproportionately attend for-profit institutions. Many come from first-generation families. They don't have the background and the information to know how to make choices about where to go and what to study. Half of all black doctoral students are now at for-profit institutions. This is something that we could do something about. Another group of students borrowing a lot of money is professional degree students. Now, whether we should worry about them or not is another question, but if you're asking where the large levels of debt come from, professional degree recipients, 20% of those who earn professional degrees borrow $200,000 or more. So looking at that top category of debt, a lot of them have professional degrees. But where they get their professional degrees makes a big difference. So 9% of those who got their degrees at public institutions borrowed $200,000 or more. 28% of those who earned their degrees at for-profit institutions borrowed this much. For-profit institutions are something else that we should worry about. Almost half of the student loan defaults come from people who went to those institutions. So that's something to worry about. And for professional students, and this is an issue that, I think is a tension for people who are interested in promoting the interests of higher education in Washington, we allow these students to borrow the whole cost of attendance, tuition, fees, books, rent, food, everything, for as many years as they are in school, and then they can go into income-based repayment. So you can go to law school and borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a lot of lawyers don't, become very wealthy, and that's part of the debt that we're probably going to end up forgiving. So what should we do about this? We should not say, oh, no problem, everything's fine, debt is not skyrocketing. We should say, look, there are many students struggling to pay for college. There are many students struggling to repay their loans. There are also, by the way, students who struggle to complete college because they avoid borrowing. Hispanic students tend to borrow much less than other students, and when they do that, they may end up working extensively, they may end up being hungry while they're in school, and borrowing a few $1,000s extra could solve some of their problems. But we need to focus on targeted solutions. We need to think about the groups of students who are particularly vulnerable and protect them. And we need to minimize problematic borrowing in the future. So forgiving all the student debt doesn't really make any sense, because again, we'd be forgiving a lot of debt that belongs to people in high-income households. Forgiving all of the outstanding student debt could pay for 20 years of free public college tuition or 50 years of Pell Grants at current levels. So Pell Grants fund low-income students. Forgiving debt isn't going to help anybody go to college. It's only going to do something about people who have already gone to college. So we need to think hard about the alternative uses of our funds. We need I think most of what institutions can do is worry about non-completers. We must increase our completion rates in college so we have fewer people going to college, borrowing money, and leaving with debt, but nothing else to show for it. We need to worry about for-profit institutions and about other institutions that don't serve their students well. If the federal government is making loans to students, that is essentially saying to a student, here, take our money, go to that institution, you'll get something that's worth paying for. And we need to make sure that we do a better job of not allowing students to take their funds to institutions that won't serve them well. And I think that one of the most difficult problems to solve is the race and ethnicity problem. And I mean, obviously, we need to do something throughout society to reduce the inequalities by race and ethnicity. But meanwhile, we need to do something about the students who are borrowing more than they should be borrowing because of the decisions they're making, the preparation with which they come to college, the amount of time they spend in college, and the opportunities that they face both in college and after college. So instead of saying student debt a crisis, we should say student debt a serious problem for some students and some institutions, but a policy that opens doors to educational opportunity for many people who otherwise would not be able to get the higher education that could transform their lives. So what I hope for all of you is that you can engage in this conversation in a more nuanced way than it tends to be in the public discourse. There is so much panic out there and so many solutions resulting from the panic that we, as people who know students and know the education that they are getting as a result of piecing together the funds, have to be able to both give good advice and ensure that the education that they're getting is worth the investment, but also help people understand why borrowing for college makes sense, why the stories that we hear, which may individually be true, do not actually represent the reality of what providing students with the access to credit they need to pay for college, to not work too much while they're in college, to not be hungry while they're in college, how access to that funding can transform people's lives and can make them so much better off in the long run, even if they have to repay their student loans. Thank you.